Hello, welcome back. Today we'll use some different grammatical structures, but with a particular idea in mind this time. We're going to try and use these structures to show detail in our sentences, because when you do that, your sentences have more clarity. All right, so let's go. So in this lesson, we're going to use reported speech, relative clauses, which we have seen and used before, and of course linking words. But this time, as I said, let's focus on bringing detail to the sentences. In order to do that, I'll also use the words particularly and especially. I tend to use these a lot when I speak and I write, so why not use them too? Also, before we look at the example sentences and look at the grammar, let's just look at some of the vocabulary that I want to use today before we start. So often students say a lot of. So I don't want to say that today. I want to use a different phrase. So I'm going to use a significant number of. Now, obviously, we want to avoid the word bad. And so bad for health or bad for your health is something I don't want to say. So if I give you an example about health, look out for the term detrimental to your health. And I've used detrimental before in examples. It's a good word to use. Of course, I don't want to keep saying people say. So instead, I'm going to use the reported speech that I mentioned at the beginning. For example, it is often argued that. A common phrase I hear students use when they speak and when they write is help people relax, or it helps me relax. Well, I don't want to say that. All basic words, very general. So I'm going to use foster emotional well-being. That's the topic of health again, so let's look out for that. Again, another general phrase would be show real things. Okay, not very clear what that means. So instead, I'm going to be using present factual content. They're real things. And talking about health, I may want to say something makes people fat. But again, that's extremely general and vague vocabulary and quite informal also. So let's not say that. Let's say contributes to rising obesity rates. So these are words and phrases that I would like to use in some of the examples we're going to see instead of very basic terms. All right, let's look quickly at reported speech. Now, many of you have studied reported speech at school, no doubt, and in your English classes. It can be quite complicated because you have to keep changing the tense. But the examples I'm going to give you today are academic and are useful for academic writing, and you don't need to change the tense. All right, so let's have a look. First of all, reported speech is used to show what someone else has said without using direct quotes. So it's often used in formal or academic writing to refer to expert opinions or common beliefs. So that's how we want to use it in our writing. Why use it in IELTS writing task 2? Well, it sounds more academic and objective. That's a good start. It shows grammatical range. You're using reported speech in your essay, and it allows you to bring in other people's ideas if you know some. Here are some common reporting phrases, most of which we can put at the beginning of a sentence. It is said that, experts have suggested that, and researchers believe that. Good way to start sentences and still sound academic, but also you're using reported speech. It has been argued that. So to summarize, reported speech helps make writing sound more formal and academic. For example, direct speech, people say fast food is unhealthy. Reported speech, it has been stated that fast food is unhealthy. Direct speech, experts say education must be improved. Reported, experts have argued that education must be improved. Very simple to use, really, at the start of a sentence. Let's quickly remind ourselves about relative clauses. So usually relative clauses are good for putting in some extra information into a sentence. Relative clause adds extra information to a noun by using words like which, that, or whose. There's other ones too, but We'll just look at the simple ones at the moment. Why use it? It combines ideas smoothly. So it's very important to write sentences with more than one clause. So you use a relative clause, that's good. It adds complexity and detail. So yes, so it can bring in extra information, detail, and that is always good for your essay. It usually makes things much more clearer. It avoids short, choppy sentences because you don't want short sentences if you want a good mark. And the common ones, as you probably know already, who for people, that for people or things, and whose to show possession, like belonging to. All right, so let's look at the grammar then, using clauses. Relative clause helps combine ideas and brings detail. So for example, art is good. It helps people relax. So you see very basic vocabulary, but you also should see these are two very short sentences. They immediately must be stuck together. One way of doing this is using a relative clause, because then you can give a little more detail also. Art, which helps people relax, is beneficial to emotional well-being. So the point has changed in this sentence. You've put helps people relax into that relative clause and used it as additional information. Why? Because you've got something more important to say in the sentence. Here's another example. Cities build more roads, they have less traffic. So two short sentences again, no use for a good mark. Let's make it longer. Cities that build more roads tend to have less traffic. So this one is smooth and it sticks the sentences together. All right, so let's have a look then. Here's the topic of education. We've seen it before. Perhaps we'll recognize some of the words. So a band 5 sentence may look like this. Online learning is flexible, but it's not good for everyone. What you want to do there is make the vocabulary more formal and specific, and then bring in grammar, maybe to make it flow better, sound more formal, and maybe even add some extra detail. So we're going to do that. We're going to use relative clauses, reported speech, and linking words, and we'll include especially particularly in there also to see if they help. So here it is. Online learning is flexible, but it's not good for everyone. So this part, but it's not good for everyone, is very basic vocabulary. Can we do anything about this? Online learning is flexible, yep, but it may not suit every learning style. So we've changed the vocabulary and made it more formal and a little more specific, talking about learning styles. And then we change it again. Experts have claimed that online learning is flexible, although it may not suit every learning style. So what have we done this time? First thing we've done is we've begun with a reported speech. So experts have claimed that. So you put that at the beginning, and then you say online learning is flexible. And instead of saying, which is a very basic linking word, we used a better one. Although it may not suit every learning style, that sentence looks much more formal already. But let's give it a bit more detail, for example. So experts have claimed that online learning, which offers flexibility, has revolutionized access to education, although it may not suit every learning style. So we've brought in the relative clause. So what we can do is we can add extra information, or we can put the information we've got into that clause and make a more particular point. So we began with online learning is flexible, but it's not good for everyone. We went for a band 7, brought in grammar, changed the vocabulary, brought a bit more detail, and we've got experts have claimed that online learning, which offers flexibility, has revolutionized access to education, although it may not suit every learning style. Good sentence. All right, government and politics this time. So band 5 may say something like this. Politicians don't keep their promises, so people don't trust them. Very straightforward statement. First thing to notice here, apart from the basic vocabulary, is the use of contractions. 2 times it says don't. So you should never do this in an academic or formal essay. You should write do not, never the contraction. All right, so we've got relative clauses, reported speech, linking words, maybe particularly and especially, if that's useful. Politicians don't keep their promises, so people don't trust them. So we want to get rid of don't and people don't trust them. So instead of saying don't keep their promises, let's say politicians fail to keep their promises, because it is a failing, so people don't trust them. We bring in the reported speech. It is often stated that politicians fail to keep their promises, so instead of saying people don't trust them, they lose public support. Now, if you notice, as with the last example, when we use reported speech, it is often stated that, so you're using present simple, and then you do not change the tense after that. So that's it's a simple way of doing reported speech without getting mixed up in all the complicated changing of times, etc. So if you use it this way, you can keep the same tense. Let's add some detail, bring in a relative clause perhaps. So it's often stated that politicians who fail to keep their promises lose public trust, whereas transparent governance tends to gain long-term support. So this sentence makes another point, and it uses a connecting word this time, a linking word, and it's got the relative clause, and we have much more detail. So it's often stated that politicians who fail to keep their promises lose public trust. So that's just the beginning now, and we're contrasting that with the word whereas. Transparent governance tends to gain long-term support. So it's a longer, more complex and detailed question, and obviously with some good vocabulary in there. So we've gone from politicians don't keep their promises, so people don't trust them. We're going to be a bit more specific. It's often stated that politicians who fail to keep their promises lose public trust, whereas transparent governance tends to gain long-term support. So you're comparing and contrasting here in particular. Food and health. And 5, fast food has too much sugar and fat, and it makes people fat. So first of all, the word fat is repeated, but also it's not seen as a very formal expression, a formal word. So we should change that. We've got people, we've got makes. So these are the words that we would like to change immediately, if possible. Has too much, and it makes people fat. I suppose the first use of the word fat has a slightly different meaning from the second. The second is the most informal, so we'll change that. Fast food has high levels of sugar and fat, and it makes people fat. So this time, instead of saying has too much sugar, it has high levels of sugar. Try again. Fast food has high levels of sugar and fat and contributes to rising obesity rates. And that's one of the expressions that I said earlier at the beginning of the lesson. All right, we want to add more detail this time. Let's try it. Do we keep the same point or do we focus on something else? Nutritionists have warned that, there's your reported speech, fast food, which contains high levels of sugar and fat, so that's our relative clause, contributes significantly to rising obesity rates, especially among young people. So there's a little detail added with the use of especially. So what have we got? We've got reported speech, we've got a relative pronoun, a relative clause, and then we've got especially, and we've added a little more detail in there. So we've gone from fast food has too much sugar and fat and makes people fat to nutritionists have warned that fast food, which contains high levels of sugar and fat, contributes significantly to rising obesity rates, especially among young people. Not only a very good sentence and formal sounding, it's got a lot more detail in that one little sentence. Sport, band 5 may say team sports are good because they help people work together. So lots of basic vocabulary there. Begin to think, how would you change this? You want to change the words first, then bring in some of the grammar that I'm looking at today. How would you do this? So team sports are good because they help people work together. So we want to remove a lot of these words and replace them with something better. Well, we could say team sports are popular as they encourage collaboration and discipline. So the words are all better already. We've got popular instead of good. We've got as instead of, because it's very easy to keep saying writing because all the time. So let's use some variation at least. Instead of saying they help people work together, we say they encourage collaboration and discipline. You could say between people, but you don't need to. So this time a relative clause. Team sports, which are popular in schools, encourage collaboration and discipline. Right, here comes the reported speech. Some educators argue that team sports, which are popular in schools, encourage collaboration and discipline. So we're very interested in the fact that the team sports encourage collaboration and discipline. And a little more detail, this time we'll bring in a linking word. Although team sports, which encourage collaboration and discipline, are popular in schools, some educators argue that individual sports offer greater opportunities for personal growth. So in this example, we've changed the focus of the sentence and we've given it more detail, and it seems more thoughtful also. So you can change the focus by using the grammar and focus on something that's perhaps more important, and you can make a clearer point. Band 5, team sports are good because they help people work together. Band 7, although team sports, which encourage collaboration and discipline, are popular in schools, some educators argue that individual sports offer greater opportunities for personal growth. So generally, you could say it still generally means a similar thing, but it's a lot more detailed now, a lot more specific. So you're talking about individual sports giving more to somebody personally, instead of just the first example where you're saying, team sports help everybody. So they mention team sports, but then they bring in a new point, individual sports. Family and relationships this time. Kids, we don't want to use this word, it's too informal. With good families are stronger when they have problems. So it's very basic sentence, basic vocabulary, and also it's not very clear what they mean exactly. So there's plenty of words there we wish to change. Let's start with the reported speech. Some researchers believe that children with good families are stronger when they have problems. So it's a little more formal sounding, but I'm still not quite clear what exactly it means. And beginning with some researchers believe that is much better than saying some people say that. Researchers for a start. So some researchers believe that children who grow with good families develop more emotional resistance when they have problems. So we've added the relative clause this time to give a little more detail, but also we've changed the vocabulary. And this time with the change of vocabulary, we begin to see the point a bit better. So with good families develop more emotional resistance. Now it's getting a bit specific. I start to understand the point more. And finally, some researchers believe that children who grew up in supportive families are more likely to develop emotional resilience, good word, even if they face challenges at school. So this time the detail makes the point very clear. And again, what have we used? We've used reported speech, relative clause, and at the end we've said even if this time to stress. And 5, kids with good families are stronger when they have problems. And 7, some researchers believe that children who grow up in supportive families are more likely to develop emotional resilience, even if they face challenges at school. And I think that this is a clear example where the first sentence was a little vague and you weren't sure what they meant. You're pretty sure in the next sentence. Film and media, documentaries show real things and help people learn. So there are very clearly words that we don't want to use here. So let's change it to begin with. Documentaries, instead of showing real things, present factual content. Remember that? I mentioned it at the beginning of the lesson. And instead of saying help people learn, influence public opinion, which again, it's a little more detailed. To help people learn is very general. That could mean anything. But influence public opinion, that has a little more detail to that. It's very particular. Let's add in reported speech. Critics have noted that documentaries present factual content and influence public opinion. So that whole sentence now looks formal, but we want a little more detail. Does that mean we change the focus? Let's see. Critics have noted that documentaries which present factual content in a compelling way can influence public opinion, and here we use particularly this time, particularly on controversial issues. So this sentence, of course, now uses relative clause, reported speech, and we've put in particularly, and it's got a lot more detail and a lot more focus on a particular thing the person wants to say. So in these examples, you don't necessarily have to say the exact same thing as the first sentence. You can expand upon it, or you can use that and make a better point. Documentaries show real things and help people learn. Becomes critics have noted that documentaries which present factual content in a compelling way can influence public opinion, particularly on controversial issues. All good words in there. So there you have it. That is a quicker look at some grammar. And this time it's using grammar not only to make good complex sentences, but it's also there to show you how you can use this grammar to actually give more detail and make yourself clearer in your sentences. Okay. So if you like that, please like and press the subscribe button below, and I'll see you next time.